Hola a todos, bienvenidos al primer webinar de nuestra serie de seminarios de este invierno del 2023. Hoy día tenemos la presentación titulada Go Their Own Way, Valdivia, Countermovements at Buen Suceso. Dr. Sara Rowe, Dr. Gay Duke y Dr. Sara Juengst nos contarán sus investigaciones en Ecuador. Antes de comenzar, mientras se van uniendo los participantes a la reunión, nos gustaría reconocer la importancia de la tierra que cada uno consideramos y llamamos hogar. De costa a costa, reconocemos con humildad y agradecimiento el territorio ancestral y eterno perteneciente al pueblo inuit, metis y primeras naciones cuyo hogar es esta tierra. También informarles que nuestro próximo seminario web tendrá lugar en febrero y tendremos al doctor Alberto Sarcina, que nos hablará sobre su proyecto de arqueología comunitaria en Colombia. No se olviden. Hello everyone, welcome to the first webinar of our winter webinar series for this year. Today we have the talk, Go Their Own Way, Valdivia Countermovements at Buen Suceso. Dr. Sara Rowe, Dr. Gay Duke, and Dr. Sara Juengst will be presented all about their research in Ecuador. Before we get started, while we meet in a virtual platform, we would like to acknowledge the importance of the land which we each call home. From coast to coast, we respectfully acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. We would also let you know that our next webinar in February will feature Dr. Alberto Sarcina, who will discuss his archaeology project in a conflict area in Colombia. Please mark it on your calendars. Now I will pass to Alexa, who will introduce today's guest speakers.
Thanks so much, Patricia. So I'm very honored and very glad to have our three speakers here today. So Sara M. Rowe is an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. As an archaeological specialist, focusing in on the material culture of Latin America, she focuses her research on the Valdivia tradition of coastal Ecuador. Dr. Rowe's research investigates questions of social organization and identity in the context of incipient social inequality. In archaeological practice, she focuses on ceramic analysis, community collaboration in archaeology, as well as digital methods for conducting archaeological analyses, as well as communicating research results. And her important public engagement and publication record have been featured in the Journal of Field Archaeology, the Journal of Anthropological Archaeology, and Latin American Antiquity. Guy Duke is an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. He's an anthropological archaeologist that explores themes related to foodways, social identity, materiality, and social memory. Dr. Duke has investigated the production and use of chicha in the Andes, the San Andres Canal system in Chimborazo, Ecuador, and the culinary practices among late Moche communities of North Coastal Peru. His publications have been featured in Cambridge Archaeological Journal, Journal of Archaeological Science, and the Oxford Handbook of the Inca. And then finally, but not leastly, Dr. Sara Juengst is an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. She specializes in bioarchaeology and Andean archaeology. She's conducted research in Bolivia and Peru and began research in Ecuador in 2017. She's also worked locally assisting with field projects in the southeastern United States when possible. Dr. Juengst is particularly interested in using human skeletal remains to investigate people's identities and social structures in the past. And she's worked with human remains to evaluate past medical practices and violent levels within Andean populations. And some of her publications can be found in Bioarchaeology International, the Journal of Human Biology, Journal of Archaeological Science, and then she has a book coming out next month titled Cooperation and Hierarchy in Ancient Bolivia. So I'll pass it over to our wonderful speakers for today for our first webinar of 2023. Take it away, you three.
Thank you so much, Alexa, and all the other members of the CLAAS coordinating committee for getting this all set up. What we're presenting on is a number of years of research focused on a particular site, Buen Suceso, which is part of our larger Proyecto Arqueológico de los Ríos Culebra Colín, which is a collaborative archaeological project conducted with the Comuna dos Mangas in Ecuador. So I'm Sara Rowe, and I'm joined today by two of my co-directors, Guy Duke and Sara Juengst, and we're all going to be sharing presenting duties here, so you'll hear from both of us, from all of us. I have presented some of these ideas previously, so some of the themes may be familiar, but this talk is really also going to bring in the information from our most recent field seasons, which hasn't been incorporated into that, and somewhat complicates what we thought about the past. So of course, we welcome questions at the end, and we are always eager to hear your ideas.
All right. Increasingly, archaeologists and other scholars broadly are considering how we approach power, civilization, and complex society. As many of us here probably saw, recent popular books like The Dawn of Everything by Graeber and Wingrove, and academic literature more broadly have questioned the nature of human social organization and whether hierarchy is normative and inevitable, or if alternate forms might be more common, or at least existing. In particular, as Wingrove and Graeber summarize, does increasing complexity in terms of settled villages, agricultural investment, and public architecture necessitate coercion and inequality? Graeber and Wingrove argue that the whole question of inequality was a European response to the critiques articulated by indigenous thinkers, primarily in the Americas. Many archaeologists, probably some of us here, reacted to Graeber and Wingrove with kind of a, well, duh. But if you review recent publications in archaeology, there's a real focus on power and social organization in terms of hierarchy, and that competition and hierarchy are still the most commonly presented models for the past, whereas anarchy, heterarchy, and cooperation are less frequently considered or represented. And the choices people make towards one form of social organization or another are almost never discussed, which ultimately leads back to the question, is that because hierarchy and competition are the norm and thus inevitable, or because we're kind of pre-programmed to see them that way? Bork in 2019 kind of ran with this point to suggest that, in fact, we don't just rely on these same tired models steeped in colonial thought, but we in fact reproduce our own current social expectations in our interpretations of the past. He uses the concept of prefiguration to argue that archaeological sites are mobilized, quote, not just to legitimize the state, but to create a future history where alternative power structures, egalitarian, non-state, indigenous, pre-colonial, seem impossible to achieve, or worse, are forgotten, unquote. So, inspired by these ideas, today we're going to approach archaeological interpretations of social processes during the Ecuadorian formative with an explicitly anarchical approach. What happens if we stop looking for hierarchy, stop assuming agriculture needs top-down control, and make room for people's varied choices about alternate forms of social organization?
All right, as you all know, Ecuador is a small nation in the northwestern corner of South America. It has a variety of ecozones, including part of the Amazon rainforest, high volcanoes and mountains as part of the Andes mountain range, lower coastal hills, and coastal tropical forests. Because of its location jutting out in the west of South America, Ecuador's coast is where the southern cold Humboldt Current meets the warmer equatorial current, which means that ocean life there is incredibly rich and creates a cool, misty coastline. This is also an active volcanic zone, as the Nazca Plate under the Pacific Ocean slides under the South American Plate. Despite, or perhaps because of these environmental factors, people have lived in Ecuador for at least 15,000 years, ably using these different environments to their advantages. People in what is now Ecuador created some of the earliest ceramics in the Americas. They domesticated corn, tomatoes, and cacao, and were master seafarers, trading as far north as West Mexico and south along the Peruvian coast.
To continue to situate you in time and space, let me introduce you to the Ecuadorian chronology. There are main periods on the left and cultural traditions of the coastal region on the right. This synthetic Ecuadorian chronology was developed by Betty Meggers most accessibly and comprehensively in her 1966 book, Ecuador. Her 4-period chronology was explicitly evolutionary and treats cultural phenomenon as analogous to biological organisms. In this framework, the simple mobile bands of hunter-gatherers in the pre-ceramic or aceramic were then replaced by the tribal village agriculturalists of the formative period. And of course, this is where we'll be focusing our attention today, on the early formative Valdivia tradition. Developments in the formative then set the stage for future developments of regional chiefdom traditions in the regional development period. which were in turn replaced by larger social political entities in the integration period, which lasted until the arrival of the Spanish in AD 1532.
According to this sequence, the Valdivia culture from about 4400 to 1450 BC corresponds to this early formative period. Noted for the early development of ceramic technology, settled village life, and incipient agriculture, Valdivia developed out of the preceding aceramic Las Vegas culture, for which there is evidence of initial experimentation with domestication, the existence of seasonal central places, and ritual practices, which Valdivia later elaborated. So the Valdivia tradition is thus prime for thinking about power and the development of hierarchy, particularly as it reflects kind of our modern perspectives, as it is one of the first sedentary agricultural and ceramic producing traditions in the Americas. Known for its pottery tradition, including these beautifully incised patterns, and for a corpus of ceramic and stone figurines that are generally glossed as Venus figurines or Valdivia Venuses, the Valdivia tradition is doing really interesting artistic things, but otherwise is a little bit still misunderstood. The figurines are often found broken, discarded in refuse, and sometimes guarded in special caches. And, today in coastal Ecuador are kind of the emblem of coastal archaeological traditions. Valdivia thus checks the box of many hallmarks of what's been called the Neolithic transition, the combination of agriculture, sedentism, and shared ritual, emerging and often considered to be directly correlated with increasing hierarchy. The original Neolithic package, of course, was based on interpretations of early agricultural settlements in the Middle Eastern Levant, where agriculture, population growth, and sedentary villages seem at times to have corresponded with increased personal wealth and top-down control. But clearly, environmental conditions, agricultural practices, social values, and traditions, among many, many other factors, vary pretty widely between the Middle East and coastal Ecuador. So applying the Neolithic package to the Ecuadorian coast may not really be appropriate, despite that some interpretations of Valdivia have trended this way.
So to talk a bit more about Valdivia, the fluorescence of early Valdivia occupation of the Ecuadorian coast. So these are phases 1 through 2A from approximately 4400 to 3000 BC. Has been recorded primarily at sites located adjacent to the Santa Elena Peninsula in modern-day Santa Elena province, and includes the Real Alto site. Circular or U-shaped villages composed of a cleared central plaza surrounded by a ring of midden and habitation were likely home to 50 to 100 inhabitants. These villages were spaced out along river bottoms, suggesting each site was autonomous but interacting with other nearby sites.
In Middle Valdivia, phases 2B and 3 from 3000 to 2400 BC, regional ceremonial sites first appear. Real Alto transitions from a circular village in early Valdivia to a 12.4 hectare rectangular site with a central plaza and mound constructions surrounded by a residential zone that was likely home to over 1,000 people. The transition from early to middle Valdivia at Real Alto is also accompanied by increasing population density adjacent to the arable land of the river valleys, reflected by increased numbers of hamlets located in these valleys, each composed of a small group of domestic structures. The processes seen in this period at Real Alto have been identified as a Neolithic revolution by its researchers.
In late Valdivia, population declined on the Santa Elena Peninsula, resulting in an apparent dispersal of the population to other areas on the coast. Small hamlets proliferated in this region, and sites like Real Alto experienced population decline, changing their function to serve as largely empty regional ritual centers. And in fact, terminal Valdivia, phases 8A to 8B, from 1800 to 1450 BC, occupation is virtually absent at Real Alto. Large Valdivia occupations in late Valdivia were founded both to the north and south of the such as the La Emerencia site in El Oro province, which was characterized by 2 low mounds in a cleared plaza area.
This occupation persists into the terminal Valdivia period, where sites such as San Isidro in Manabí province were characterized by large mounds. The late and terminal Valdivia sites generally lack the signature circular construction of earlier Valdivia in favor of organization around large mounds.
So if we were to take this synthesis with its correlation of site size, mound construction, and settlement pattern as proxies for complexity, we might be able to visualize or imagine something like this. So Real Alto starts much like any other site, but undergoes a major reorientation in Middle Valdivia that marks it as unique among other Valdivia sites. Its star seems to fade in late Valdivia as its population disperses to other centers, and other centers are founded elsewhere. Those processes that kicked off at Real Alto seem to continue at the sites on the margin through the terminal Valdivia period. But in this story, that transition from early to middle Valdivia highlights what is expected in terms of increasing social inequalities, incipient inequalities, specialized burial, controlled participation in ritual activities on the mound, and other hallmarks that are often associated with inequality.
So we can imagine, we can ask, does Buen Suceso, a formative village site, kind of fit the prescribed model for Valdivia's social changes with increasing hierarchy over time, particularly between that early and middle Valdivia time period? How does the assumption that agriculture and sedentism necessitate top-down control bias our view of these processes? So here we interrogate the evidence of power and social organization at Buen Suceso with this anarchical or cooperative mindset and ask, could people have built a community that didn't rely on hierarchical control?
So Buen Suceso lies 9 kilometers inland along the Mango Alto Valley in the Santa Elena province of coastal Ecuador. And you can see it marked here on the map in relation with the type site of Valdivia and other well-known sites, Loma Alta, and then of course, Real Alto down here. It is located right on the flanks of the Chongon Colonche Hills, the coastal hill range. And local ecozones within a few hours walk of the site includes maritime littoral resources of the Equatorial Pacific, including mangrove swamps, as well as dry scrublands and tropical cloud forests. The average rainfall in the area is 530 millimeters per year, which is approximately twice that received on the Santa Elena Peninsula. So the environmental conditions that we're dealing with at Buen Suceso are quite different than those that would have been found at Real Alto. Buen Suceso is approximately 12 kilometers north of Loma Alta, and a modern footpath still connects these areas across Intervalley Hills. Buen Suceso is 20 kilometers away from the Valdivia type site, following valley and coastal routes. The proximity of these sites is such that their inhabitants could have been in semi-frequent contact. Real Alto is approximately 70 kilometers to the south in the Chandui River drainage and would have involved 2 or more days of travel to reach. It was likely this part of the interaction zone for people at Buen Suceso, but for more occasional interactions. The site itself measures 130 by 100 meters and is characterized by a raised U-shaped midden surrounding a cleared plaza area. The spatial layout is characteristic of early Valdivia sites, but at Buen Suceso, it seems to have persisted throughout the 2,300-year occupation of the site presented here. The site is situated in a farmed field located on the lands of the Comuna dos Mangas, who we work with. A modern road cuts the western edge of the site, and the southern arm of the village midden is partially eroded by the Rio Culebra, which is a tributary of the Mango Alto River. Along the north side here is a slight rise that partially encircles and then extends into the midden ring of the site. This finger ridge was augmented during early Valdivia and transformed into a mound that was used on and off throughout the occupation of the site. Thus far, radiocarbon dates indicate that the site was occupied between 3750 and 1425 BC, almost the entirety of the Valdivia tradition, though few areas of the site yet demonstrate occupation from multiple phases. Early Valdivia dates have been found on the north half of the site, while middle Valdivia dates come from the plaza. Late Valdivia dates were recovered from the southern arm of the midden and the mound, while terminal Valdivia dates have come from an area along the central curve of the Midden.
The earliest dates at the site have been found on the mound, an area referred to as Unit 6. Excavations in the 2022 season have shown us, though, that this early mound construction may not be quite so straightforward. The sterile soil surface on the mound rises 2 meters above the plaza area of the site. Around 3100 BC, villagers built a compacted caliche floor on top of the mound, outlined with post holes placed approximately 50 centimeters apart. Materials embedded in this floor include generally unremarkable fragments of pottery, several with burnt residues, and a large pounding stone, but do little to clarify the activities that would have taken place in this structure. It appears, though, that special attention was given to dismantling the structure rather than letting it deteriorate. When the posts were removed, they were filled with clean yellow sand taken from the beach about 9 kilometers away. While tentative, this suggests that the structure on the mound held some ritual importance.
This is a view down into the plaza from the mound, so you can have a bit of a sense of what that change of elevation looks like. In Middle Valdivia, at the same time that big changes were happening at Real Alto, the ritual focus at Buen Suceso seemed to have moved to the plaza in the center of the site. And here we encountered a floor that was roughly rectangular in shape and measured 3 meters by 6 meters, with the long axis oriented slightly northeast-southwest. The floor was originally composed of river cobbles that were covered with clay. Over time, this clay has dissolved, encompassing the cobbles and any associated artifacts in the clay matrix. In some places, 2 layers of cobble were separated by a thin lens of clay, suggesting a remodeling or renovation episode of this floor. That such activity was needed is not surprising given how wet the local environment is and how susceptible to degradation such a clay floor would be, particularly because there is no evidence of a wall trench or post holes that would indicate that this floor was surrounded by a wall or had a roof. In the northwest corner of the floor, we found a spiral made of stones, and which would have presumably been covered in clay. While small, only about 75 centimeters across, there are other sites, such as La Palanda, where spirals indicate a special place. In a line running near the center of the floor, we encountered 5 post holes. The smallest was 15 centimeters in diameter, and the biggest was 40 centimeters across, and had a layer of stones lining the base, presumably to stabilize the post that rested in it. Residual charcoal in this pit returned a calibrated date of 2857 to 2500 BC, which are phases 2B and 3, or Middle Valdivia. We suggest that these posts that would not have been functional to support a roof or wall may have instead been carved, such as the carved Huasango posts that we find in the integration period Huancavilca tradition. We also found the skeletal remains of two individuals in one in a shallow depression near the northern edge of the site, were isolated skeletal fragments of a child, likely between 6 and 8 years old. Immediately outside the boundary of the cobbles, but in association with the floor, was the primary interment of a juvenile individual 10 to 12 years of age. And finally, underlying the western edge of the floor, near the central point of the long axis, was a dedicatory deposit, likely placed immediately prior to the construction of the floor. This deposit contained 2 nested, inverted vessels that had had their rims removed, leaving behind just the shallow bases, which were used to cover a figurine fragment. The innermost vessel is red slipped, which is a color associated with ritual importance. And this inner vessel had been used to burn organic material, an incensario, and so there was still residual charcoal in the base, which also dated to Middle Valdivia. And I want to pause for a moment to envision what this floor would have looked like while it was in use. So again, no evidence that there was a structure around it or even a roof. And instead, this prepared floor would have been constructed slightly above the surrounding ground surface of the plaza and finished with clay. It was high enough that one would have had to step up to walk upon it, and as such, it may have marked a liminal or ritually important space, possibly again with these carved posts. And while this would have been a special space, it was also one that could have been accessible to everyone in the village, located on the central plaza, slightly below the living surface of most of the houses. Any activity that occurred on this floor would have been visible to everyone at the site, which is a marked difference from the types of limited participation rituals that researchers suggested took place within the structures on top of the mounds at Real Alto.
Moving into late Valdivia, around 2300 BC, there was a renewed utilization on the mound. First, people covered the previous structure with approximately 50 centimeters of compacted midden deposits, which can be interpreted both as a purposeful covering and termination of the older use of the area, as well as an effort to raise the mound even higher above the plaza surface. The soil for this fill was likely mined from elsewhere at the site and placed over the old structure. The order of radiocarbon dates is inverted in this area, with the oldest dates above the youngest dates. From the radiocarbon dates included in this fill, we can infer that the site was inhabited as far back as 3750 BC, but we have not yet encountered secure deposits from this earliest period. On top of these 50 centimeters of fill, the inhabitants of Buen Suceso then built a new structure. This structure was characterized by a compact dirt floor surrounded by a wall trench, which was 20 centimeters wide and 30 centimeters deep. The structure was oval shaped and measured 4.5 meters by 3.5 meters, with the long axis oriented east-west. The opening of the structure was located on the northwest side of the structure, away from the center of the site. Interred within the wall trench of the structure were the remains of two subadults. The first, a 6-month-old infant, was found lying on its side in a fetal position, its head facing south. The partial remains of a second individual, a juvenile aged 10 to 12, were also found adjacent to the southern wall of the structure. Clavicles, ribs, vertebrae, and other skeletal elements of the torso were recovered, but the skull and lower body were missing. These sorts of interments accompanying construction are quite common for Valdivia and other Andean traditions as well. Our analysis of material from the structure continues, but it is notable within the site for the quantity of artifacts related to productive activities, such as fishing, lapidary production, and possibly pottery production. The maritime activities are represented by upwards of 1,500 fish vertebrae, the majority of which were found in a 1-meter stretch of wall trench excavated in 2019. This stands in marked contrast to the 24 fish vertebrae found in all other excavations at the site to date. We also recovered a shell fish hook reamer and a net weight, which indicates that people at Buen Suceso weren't just consuming fish, but were actively involved in acquiring it. We also recovered numerous stone drills within and immediately adjacent to the structure, the only drills that have been found at the site so far. Excavations have also revealed several partially formed greenstone beads and numerous other worked pieces of greenstone that suggest some sort of lapidary production was taking place here. Lastly, numerous polishing stones suggest activities related to pottery production were also taking place here at a rate higher than other areas of the site. There's not sufficient evidence to say that this was a ritual space, despite being on top of the mound. The artifacts that we have point to a thoroughly domestic context, though clearly with some unique attributes. The activities within this mound structure were not focused on feasting, such as the mound structures at Real Alto. Instead, productive activities were emphasized. Ultimately, it is possible that activities in the structure focused on restricted economic production rather than restricted ritual participation. But this restriction could have served to concentrate power in the hands of a smaller segment of the community within late Valdivia, much as ritual activity at Real Alto did the same during middle Valdivia.
Burials are key indicators of status in terms of location, mortuary goods, and pathological indicators of stress, trauma, and overall well-being. At Buen Suceso, human remains associated with Valdivia contexts have come from the central plaza and mound areas, as Sara and Guy mentioned. Interestingly, all of these remains come from subadult individuals, from neonates through adolescents. And many of them were placed in what we interpret as dedicatory offering deposits, in wall trenches, near and associated with the floor, etc. burying deceased children and or sacrificing children at key locations is not an unusual practice for pre-Hispanic South American people, as you can see in the Guampoma illustration here, and in this isn't necessarily a deceased child in the ceramic interpretation. I believe this is Guangala, or Bahia. But you can see that the child is an important symbol enough to be represented in ceramics. These ceremonies of either sacrifice or burial of children usually acted to consecrate a structure or area or special place by creating a symbolic ancestor out of the deceased child. What is slightly unusual here is that all of the remains come from children. No adult human remains have been found at Buen Suceso from Valdivia contexts. This is in contrast to burials at Real Alto, where there were elaborate burials of key adult persons, as well as a general cemetery for the population. And so clearly there's something we're missing. It's not that adults didn't die at Buen Suceso, but when they did, they weren't being buried at these key places. We interpret the special burial of children as underscoring the power of community creation that children hold. Rather than adorning elite children or adults with mortuary goods and burying them at ritual location, the remains here, like the child near the floor, were interred alongside other objects as important offerings that didn't single out particular individuals and imbued public areas with power that many people would have had access to. Ongoing bioarchaeological analysis by Moselle Bowers, a master's student at UNC Charlotte, will help us understand the lived experience of these children and thereby the health of the broader population at Buen Suceso. So stay tuned for that update this year at the Society for American Archaeology or in her master's thesis out this summer.
So it seems clear that social organization at Buen Suceso was following a different path than Real Alto, but also experienced fluctuations over time. The mound at Buen Suceso is smaller than those at Real Alto, but still would have necessitated significant labor to construct it, particularly for the relative population at the site. Right, we're dealing with likely 1/10 of the population that you had at Real Alto. So the mounds at Real Alto contain clear evidence of ritual feasting and specialized burials. The mound at Buen Suceso, on the other hand, suggests specialized production of lapidary artifacts and processing of marine resources. It's notable that activity at Buen Suceso moved off the mound and into the plaza for a significant amount of time. This relocation off the mound may have been a deliberate choice in reaction to fledgling status aggrandizing at Buen Suceso and or in reaction to occurrences at Real Alto. By moving into open space, they would have minimized the ability of any single individual to secure isolated access to ritual power. Burying children at key locations could have functioned to unite the community into a single ancestral identity, allowing everyone to draw on the same source of power. Of course, much work remains. We are still searching for a domestic context, of which we have some tantalizing evidence that we need to expand on. Next steps also include doing a complete environmental reconstruction so that we can answer questions about how resource availability might have enabled or constrained the cooperation that we're suggesting. What role did it have in creating a picture that is very different from that found at Real Alto? Also, we know this landscape was occupied throughout the pre-Hispanic period. There's ephemeral evidence on the surface of the site for subsequent Machalia, Chorrera, and Guangala traditions. And there's also a Manteño house mound in the next field and an intrusive Manteño cemetery on the southern arm of Buen Suceso. So all of this occupation and all of this human activity needs to be put into the context of its broader landscape. By removing the assumptions of hierarchy, we can start to see nuance in social organization and the choices that people made about power in their own community. People in the past and present are not helpless in the face of an inevitable trek towards hierarchy, but are instead capable of organizing and reorganizing their communities to create new systems that work for them. This is important as it reflects the true diversity of human societies and also allows for us to imagine new possibilities for our own communities. By acknowledging the power of choice, we are not beholden to any model of society in the past or present. We would like to thank numerous individuals and organizations for support. First and foremost, the Comuna de los Mangas, who has worked or allowed me to work there since 2006 as part of this burgeoning project that we've got going. The IMPC, of course, for permitting, our respective institutions, both from graduate study and current employment, who has provided funding, Fulbright Foundation and the Brennan Foundation, all of which makes this possible. So we're happy now to open it to the floor for questions and ideas and all the rest.
Thank you so much to all three of you for a wonderful presentation. We have opened up both on our Facebook Live streaming as well as here for any members of class that would like to ask a question. So I don't see any right away, but there's a question that's popped up on Facebook Live, so I'll read it out. And the question is only children remains found at Buen Suceso is a similar theme among other Valdivia sites, or is it unique for this particular site?
It's somewhat unique. Sorry, I think I just froze there for a second. And okay, cool. It's somewhat unique. There are, you know, as we mentioned, special burial of children is not necessarily unique, but only having children at locations is an outlier. And we keep thinking, you know, we found this Monteño cemetery this summer that appeared Valdivia at first. And so we were like, here are the adults. And then the dates came back Monteño much later. And so, yeah, there's some question as to what's going on there.
There is an area on the north arm of the very edge of the north arm of the midden that we haven't fully investigated, in part because of barbed wire fence that runs right across it. But that is high on our list as some place to investigate, and possibly we'll find some of those individuals there.
Great. I can give everyone a couple more minutes to think about anything else they might want to ask our speakers. But I was curious about, in particular, the evidence that you were showing around these special deposits, the spirals, the red pigmentation. So I guess on the side of the spirals, is it something that's also incised in and worked into the types of pottery as well as the other types of artifacts that are found in those deposits? And then for the greenstone and the red pigment, are those items coming from far distances, or can they be locally procured? So how kind of far are people coming from to make these special deposits if they're visitors to this place?
Yeah, so in terms of the spiral, we do see that motif on pottery in the Valdivia tradition and beyond. So it is very frequent. It's oftentimes thought to perhaps indicate waves. But La Palanda, of course, also known as the Mayo Chinchipe, La Florida site, right? Like that's spiral on a large scale. It all goes to the center of that spiral, and then there's that magnificent burial under there. We didn't have anything under this spiral, but it does bring up questions of, you know, exchange of these concepts and utilizing them in similar ways, at least, if not in the exact same way. So yes, spirals generally we do see in a number of places. As far as the pigment, the iron that would have been needed to make the red pigment, so there haven't been a ton of compositional studies done on Valdivia ceramics yet. Most of what we have, though, and also observation of contemporary potters, it does indicate that people are pretty much getting their stuff from their local landscape. The river that runs right by the site has a lot of interesting you know, mineral nuggets and things that wash down from the Colonche Hills. So we are actually like right at the edge of some of the tallest peaks of that range. So there is a fair bit of I guess, geologic and hydrological activity that brings things nearby. The greenstone also, so it's kind of like a clay greenstone. It's a soft stone, and that also can be found in the river. There are few occasions with slightly different types of greenstone, which would have needed to come from somewhere else, but those exact origins are still a little unknown. So we're trying not to treat the site as like an island in the middle of nowhere, right? It obviously would have had connections to people elsewhere, but it's also in such a resource-rich environment that so much of what they seem to have utilized came from very close by, with of course the exception of all of the marine resources, which were down the valley 9 kilometers. But even so, that's well within a day's activity range.
No, that's really interesting. The intersection of both sort of the need for the site to be in that region for resource exploitation, but also some of the pathways that would have been key for getting to these other major sites. It's interesting, right? Because it's sort of what's the either trade-off or what's the benefit of the site being in this landscape? Because I find that quite fascinating with all the detail that you all gave about, again, being sort of at the edge of these taller peaks, being right along a river environment that would have been really useful for the resources. But is there a sense around the convergence of different things, like even sort of like the idea of sort of a Tingui type of framework that might have been important for these communities, or was it something that likely was more sort of resource based to sort of the site being in this particular location, or was it a combination of things?
It's really hard to say. I think trying to take some of those concepts that we have ethnographically or ethnohistorically from very different cultural contexts and then apply them here is a bit tricky. The community name Dos Mangas comes because 2 tributaries join and then create the rest of the Mangue Alto River. So that was obviously an important feature in the more recent past, and may have been in the ancient past as well. We saw this repeated motif on a lot of ceramics, and in fact, the story of how I realized that this was a Valdivia site involves this motif, but it's kind of like a stair-stepped motif with a circle in the center, which we've interpreted as kind of a hill and sun motif. We found it quite frequently at the site, and we were starting to wonder if it was like maybe almost an emblem of the site, because it wasn't showing up in a lot of the other published reports. And then I think actually after the first time that I sort of said that idea out loud or in a format like this, the folks from ESPL who are still excavating at Real Alto found a piece with that same motif. So that doesn't invalidate the potential of this place being, or the mountains and the circle being the site or something like that. And maybe, we'll have to do those compositional studies and figure out if vessels were being traded, and maybe if some of what we're looking at might not be, community markers on this pottery. But yes, there's long ways to go with all of this.
But I think it's interesting, one thing we've kind of talked about is you're not that far from these other sites. And so like there is this ability to get to Real Alto, like a weekend trip, right? Or like, for big ceremonies or whatever. And it just like the timing of the movement at Buen Suceso down off the mount into the plaza is just like so close to the timing of the elaboration of stuff at Real Alto. It's very tempting to be like, some people went to Real Alto, they were like, ooh, we don't like what's going on here, we're going to deliberately do the opposite. And like, that's making a lot of assumptions, but it doesn't, also, it's possible.
The timing thing, one of the closest site of Loma Alta that was mentioned having it's still a modern path between the two. It's an early Valdivia site solely. And so that timing of that shift in middle Valdivia also coincides with the essential abandonment of that closest site. And that's intriguing to me as well.
There was a survey done by Lanning in like 1965 of the coastal valleys, and he did note what he attributed as a late Valdivia settlement right on the coast, the edge of the mouth of the river in what is now Manglar Alto. So they wouldn't have been alone on the landscape, but they seem to be unique in maintaining this circular form from that earliest period throughout the entirety of the occupation at the site. We haven't seen that elsewhere. So even if the move from the mound into the plaza was not deliberate, the maintenance of this particular village form, I think, would have been. And whether that is something that gets so ingrained as tradition, and that's how your grandparents built their houses and put them in the village, and so that's just how you keep doing it. But certainly we know elsewhere it changed. And so people would have been in contact with others living in these different forms, but yet maintain the shape of the site. So there's a lot to that, and also why we really need to make sure that we get the full occupation sequence, so we can see how people were moving around the site and their placement of their homes, and maybe there are other ritual spaces that we haven't found yet that also fit into this picture in interesting ways.
That's really fascinating. There's a couple of more questions that have popped in the chat that I think are relevant in terms of sort of this change or the timing of this. So one of them being, was there a reason why clay was used to cover the main area of the site? In terms of not remembering the specific terminology, and then did different sites have these different social hierarchical systems, or did some of them have a kind of maybe more cooperative type of social structure? And would that have affected the shapes of some of the main architectural buildings and our main architectural features of those sites? So there's those two questions from someone in the chat on Facebook Live.
So I'll say that the clay floor was immediately recognized as like a thing you do by the comuneros who are excavating that floor with me. So even though it's a wet thing that would need to be renovated or require some upkeep, it didn't seem weird to them who are now living in this same environment. So I imagine the reason to cover it with clay is partially to hold the cobbles together so that they're not spilling out, but also to give it a nice finish. It's hard to tell because it has kind of degraded into and around the cobbles, but oftentimes they're finished with a slightly different color of clay. We've seen that in different places. So like Salango, the precinct there, when they do different reconstruction, they use like more of an orange clay or more of a yellow clay, and it demarks different places. So while we can't really tell in this particular case, it could have also been of a color to mark it out as very different, either from the general brown soil that you can kind of see behind me, or the very green that it can be elsewhere. And then remind me of what the second question was.
Specifically curiosity around different sites having different sort of variations around social hierarchy, as well as potentially cooperative types of strategies, and if any of that in terms of building affected the overall kind of architectural features of the sites, the shape, general size, things like that.
So it's thought that with the early Valdivia form, the circular form, that one of the benefits may have been actually the mobility of people between sites. So if it's organized with certain patterns, familial structure, clan structure, like your place on the ring in one village may be the same as your place on the ring in a different village, and may have facilitated some of that. When we move out of early Valdivia and we start seeing primarily Real Alto, really, that transforms for middle Valdivia. But as it does, these circular villages empty out and convert into sort of scattered hamlets that occur at fairly regular intervals along the waterways, presumably to take advantage of farmland. So we see not just a change in the structure of the Real Alto site itself, but in the settlement pattern of the region. And this is also noted for like the Valdivia River Valley. For some of these other sites, don't have as good an understanding of the larger landscape that might have accompanied them, but certainly La Merenciana, there are the mounds in the plaza. There were, I believe, 4 individuals buried in those mounds in positions that suggested that they were wrapped with textiles or netting. I believe there was ochre on their bones, right? So there's definitely treatment and special place for them. And then the San Isidro mound is massive, and there's actually suggestion that it would have had a twin like on the other side of the valley that has eroded away or been mined in one form or another. And so that speaks to a more like monumental scale of settlement in that region, and there's been some interesting burials found there as well. Also a young adult, a young woman about 18 years old, who's the Capopera burial that was of a likely shaman, or at least had shamanic indicators with it. So, you know, we do see these structural changes. What we don't see is the persistence of this form anywhere else. That is definitely unique to Buen Suceso.
So we have a final question on Facebook Live, and I might piggyback on it because it's a great question. So how have your interpretations of the site changed over the years since you first began excavating there? And I guess the thing I'll add on is how have the community collaborations and dialogues also shifted with that?
So when I first started working in Dos Mangos, I actually went there to look at ethnic interaction between the Manteño and Huancavilca traditions in the late pre-Hispanic period, and then found a Valdivia site and ended up doing this. But from my dissertation work, from the areas I had excavated and the ceramics I was seeing, came away thinking that this site was unique, not because it had been occupied for 2,300 years, but because it was a late Valdivia village that had the circular form. And so suggesting that there was some kind of casting back to these earlier traditions, maybe a nostalgia for a different time. So obviously that's a bit thrown out the window since we have these much expanded date ranges, but it also, I think, makes it's just as interesting of a scenario, maintaining a form as it is recreating one. And in terms of the community collaboration, I'll say a lot of our strongest collaboration is actually with the group of community guides. There's an established ecotourism and community guiding presence in the village. And so we've worked really closely with them to make sure that they know kind of the most up-to-date information for the site, so that when they're bringing tourists through, you know, they can share what that information is. Some of our conversations with the community now are really turning towards their concern with related to climate change, right? So like, if we have dry years, how do we maintain a water source? And so what did people do in the past? Well, we happen to know of 2 cisterns, hilltop cisterns from the Manteño period in the valley, that one was partially excavated, but never to the bottom. So I think we're at a moment now where we may find ourselves slightly pulled in different directions, or reorienting the focus of the research overall to look more closely at those features, so that we can specifically address these questions that are coming from the community.
I'll also throw in there that we recently have added a cultural anthropologist to the team who lives in Ecuador, and so is able to go back a little bit more often than we are. I think important for lots of reasons, but also because, you know, the relationship with community is always complicated, and, you know, some of the feedback we've gotten is that felt like there was a communication block, right? That sometimes this knowledge didn't come back. It was not necessarily reflecting our project, but anthropologists in general who came into the region. In any case, we have been working with this culture anthropologist to be there a little bit more regularly and do community meetings. And so that's really, I think, gonna work out well. We've been working with her for about a year, so.
So the team now also includes Ana Maria Morales and Angie Farfan, who are both cultural anthropologists in Ecuador. And then our other co-director for community archaeology is Daniela Balancentegui at UMass Boston. So we went from kind of me working by myself to me dragging Guy along to then Daniela and Sara and Ana Maria and Angie. So now we have this large team that quite honestly we're just still trying to build out, because there is just so much work that can be done and so much specialization that needs to be brought to the site.
Which reminds me, while we were talking today, I remembered while Guy was talking about the fish bones, that we have this crazy big fish tumor bone. Obviously not a zooarch.
Tilly bone? Is it called a tilly bone? Is that what we decided?
Tilly bone, thank you. And based on the consultation of people on Twitter, I think Alexa, you are one of them. And my very brief internet research, it had to come from like a 15-foot long fish. So the fishing may be from the river, but some of it is obviously from the ocean.
No 15-foot long fish in those rivers.
No, some of the little crab claws that we find might be from the river. But even the majority of the fish bones, it's a quite shallow river and it's seasonal. And so fish isn't necessarily that predictable. But we've found shark vertebrae and sea urchin spines and a variety of other things that show it's definitely, there's a big maritime component.
That's fascinating. So thank you so much for all those responses and the dialogue. That's fascinating. We have our discussion was, and our questions posted on Facebook Live were really active, so that's great. So we can close that out now. Thanks everyone for joining us on Facebook Live, and then we'll join our Zoom room to say goodbye to our speakers. I'll